Welcome to this week's episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. Francis is out this week and I'm covering down for him. And last week, we talked a lot about some developments in the United Kingdom, and so I figured it would make sense to bring in an actual subject matter expert. So this week, I interview British Army veteran and writer Joe Glenton. You may remember Joe from a bonus episode a couple of months ago. Joe is the author of the memoir Soldier Box. He's a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, and he works for the anti-militarism NGO Forces Watch. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do as well. Thanks. All right. Well, Joe, welcome to What a Hell of a Way to Die. Thank you for joining me in the studio today.
Good to see you again, buddy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because this might be the first time I've done a in-studio recording with anybody.
Okay.
Francis lives in St. Louis, I live here, and I don't think we've ever done an episode even with guests where it's just been like, hey, we're recording in person. So.
Yeah, that's cool. It's cool. I'm glad to.
So last week we had a discussion about the instance where British Army soldiers were caught on film. They filmed themselves shooting training rounds at a portrait of Jeremy Corbyn at a firing range in Kabul. And this obviously provoked a significant response. And then I saw you wrote an article in the Independent about it, about the British Army and the kind of the farce of them investigating themselves. So I'm wondering, like, if you want to just maybe talk a little bit from your perspective, did this come as a surprise to see this happening?
It's always things like that. It's always a surprise when they emerge, but they themselves are not surprising because I'm sure you've seen stuff like that as well, which internally will probably be written off as banter in some ways, just lads, a couple of paratroopers. Jeremy Corbyn's not very popular, and that's certainly how the defenders of that incident tried to frame it. But of course, there is some much deeper narratives. The intention of that, which was put on Snapchat, was absolutely clear. The intention was to imply a threat to Jeremy Corbyn, which is not the first time. These are obviously four very junior NCOs, Lance Jackson privates. But of course, it wasn't too long ago, an anonymous general suggested there would be a coup against Jeremy Corbyn if he ever came to power, and various other things. But the intention was very clear that Jeremy Corbyn was a target, literally. That was what was implied in that video. And it has to be seen in the context of an increasing crossover between the far right and the military, far right and the veterans community, and I mean, there's other background and stuff. We have to understand. This is the Parachute Regiment, 3rd Battalion. It was 1st Battalion. One of the 1st Battalion guys is about to go on trial for Bloody Sunday. We're led to believe that two of the guys who were two of the paratroopers were from Northern Ireland. So there's that stuff as well. But it seems to be a complex range of things, and it's about the fash in the army, and the broader sense of Jeremy Corbyn and the left on a more macro level, I suppose, that Jeremy Corbyn is a threat to Britain's imperial past and present, I would suggest.
It's interesting to me that people are going to look at the prosecution for Bloody Sunday and somehow come down on Corbyn for that when it's the Conservative government making that decision to do it.
Yes, exactly. Weirdly, Douglas Murray, who is awful, who you will come across, he's the most awful human being, a writer for The Spectator and various other rank
right-wing rags,
wrote an absolutely superb dissection of Soldier F, pronouncing him guilty in that piece. I would suggest you go and read that, which is very good. It's really shed some light on this character. I don't think his name's come out yet, but this Soldier F and what happened on Bloody Sunday, and why Douglas Murray at least believes that he is a liar and should be tried. And Douglas Murray is not an opponent of the British establishment.
Yeah, I mean, Douglas Murray's name seems to come up pretty often with discussions of people like Niall Ferguson and Jordan Peterson, and basically just like,
certainly in that mold,
running cover for reactionary sentiment.
Exactly.
So, in your piece, what you argued was that this was part of a larger trend, and that one of the concerns is that at this moment you're seeing things like Jeremy Corbyn being attacked in an East London mosque, but you're also seeing polling showing that the Labour Party, if there were a general election held tomorrow, would likely win. And so it seems like it's reaching a fever pitch as far as like the kind of incitement that you're seeing on the right. What role do you feel like the British Army plays in that?
It's central. The way we think about the British Army, the way British Army is marketed, the way it's positioned as at the peak of kind of what British values can be, is all part of that. It's all about protecting our imperial state, our imperial past, and Jeremy Corbyn is clearly a challenge to that. It's been from the very start. Even people in the Labour Party have attacked Jeremy Corbyn on defence. Have claimed he is a sympathiser for various terrorist groups in Britain or Ireland, depending on how you want to look at it, and in the Middle East, and all that has contributed to this state where Jeremy Corbyn is perceived as a kind of legitimate target, I feel.
Yeah.
And that gives rise to things like this. And of course, we have to remember, go back and say, it's only, 2 years, 3 years since a Labour MP was murdered.
Yeah.
In her own constituency. And so I guess it's dangerous times, but a lot of it is about reducing the left to Jeremy Corbyn and attacking him in various ways and undermining him and dehumanizing him in a way to make him an easy target.
So when you were in the British Army, did you feel like there was a general kind of sense of politicization and that politicians were targeted, or there was talk of politicians being good or bad?
So I think I was in an interesting time. So Iraq was going and Afghanistan were going, and we were some of the first guys back into Afghanistan for the disastrous, idiotic Helmand mission.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was, it's very strange to look at now, because when I joined in 2004, and then my buddy joined in 1997, certainly in that period, people didn't really like soldiers. We had separate pubs for soldiers and civilians. We weren't well looked upon. Then as those wars got going and failed, there was a top-down effort to lionize soldiers.
Yeah.
The kind of heroization process, even as the wars were failing. And what we end up with now, and while there was far-right activism in the army then, particularly loyalist-flavored
Gotcha, yeah.
stuff, and some EDL. I knew some guys who were around the EDL.
I'm going to pause for a second because
sure.
most of our listeners are American. So loyalists, you mean like Northern Ireland,
Northern Irish loyalists,
yeah. So
Protestant,
Protestant loyalists, basically people who are pro remaining in, like, not Irish reunification, but rather the opposition to that. The
King Billies, the original hillbillies, if you like.
Yeah.
Which
is that we famously run into trouble when we were like, hey, let's do a quick explanation for the Troubles. It's like, wait, that's not possible. No. And then the EDL, also the English Defence League. You might want to give a little bit of background on who that is.
Who are the kind of for a long? They're not a presence anymore, but generally fascism in this country, as in most places, has had two sides. At that time, in the kind of 90s and 2000s, the electoral side was the BNP. The street thug side was the English Defence League. Mm-hmm. Huge crossover between two in terms of personnel. Tommy Robinson, for example, kind of emerged from that milieu, but particularly the EDL. He was the founder and leader of the EDL. So at that time, I knew guys who were a lot of Northern Irish Protestant people who are loyalists, who were around loyalist activism, which is very far right, very pro-British establishment. And then obviously the EDL, the kind of English nationalism stuff as well. Yeah.
So you witnessed that, or you had some experience.
I knew people who were involved in those things. For sure. Yeah. I mean it's very common to come across that, not just from also in the army. A lot of the army is obviously full of Scottish soldiers, so quite a large percentage of those would be. Sometimes it's expressed through football. Rangers and Celtic.
Yeah.
Celtic are the Catholic team, and Rangers are the Protestant team. So that you would see those far-right ideas and loyalist ideas expressed in different ways.
But now it seems like, in a way, it's gotten to be more of a fever pitch. I mean, you saw Tommy Robinson posing with a bunch of soldiers in uniform last year, I think it was, and then you see things like you were showing me previously about people like Phil Campion, the SAS veteran, who has gotten involved in all sorts of far-right things with people like Katie Hopkins and other far-right figures in this country who are explicitly anti-EU, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim. Like, they basically frame themselves as being defenders, whereas like the state won't tell you what's actually happening, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
Do you feel like that's something that's emerged from these wars, or is that something that was always latent in the British military?
We are an imperial country with an imperial past, and there are deep wells of reaction in this country, as we know. So it's always there, it's always bubbling, but certainly with the wars, with the financial crash, all these things, as we know, come together, and from that sump emerge. Fascists are parasitic, and they latch themselves onto to various causes, and of course the military is appealing to them, because the military in itself functions as a far-right organization in terms of its internal culture and what it does. It's anti-democratic. It's about power and submission. Our military clings to its imperial past, which, let's face it, is about killing brown people all over the world. And those historical events, those battles where we mowed down thousands of Africans or Indians, are celebrated in the officers' mess and toasted. It's part and parcel. So you can see why there's a lot of crossover there.
Yeah, of course. I'm interested too, because this is something that I've been talking to Francis about a lot, and I'm interested in your thought on this, is that why does the military lend itself, if not to, why do veterans seem so prone to fascism? And there's a part of me that thinks, well, because of the fact that when you get out, you're sort of cast out of an organization that gave meaning. But I think to a larger sense, I'm wondering if maybe it's because in the military, weakness is looked down upon so much, and the only political ideology that will nakedly say the weak should be destroyed is fascism.
Exactly, yeah. It is, yeah. And there's, of course, we have to make the point. It does go the other way as well, and lots of people emerge from the military, as we know, and become have good ideas. But yeah, that's certainly the case. I think that you are. It's. I guess it's that mix of things. It's where those people come from. A lot of them are downtrodden. They're already damaged. Most of the army is drawn from the working class. So they have some pre-existing stuff. They come into a deeply reactionary organization. And I often find that there are a lot of veterans who come out and they see the world through the prism of soldier, of army, and they try and apply those things to the world in terms of like weakness, in terms of race, in terms of gender, and so on and so on. So you can see why it would make you a bit of an arsehole, to be honest. And certainly that's what we see, which of course isn't to say, because there are lots of veterans historically and now who are on the left, and I think it's increasingly important now to try and organise those when we look at what's going on. But it is contested; it goes both ways. But generally, the fact that so many of them end up involved in right-wing activism, or at least with right-wing ideas, is telling, I think.
Looking at the history of British soldiers and British veterans in labor politics and specifically labor activism, looking specifically at the election in 1945, like the British military, the demobilization of the army after World War II played a huge role in that. What was going on, like there was Britain wound up with a socialist government for one time in its history, primarily because of the military. And I'm wondering if you felt like you could comment on that.
And that period, there's a kind of a long series of veterans rebellions in this country, and that is one of them. There was another one in the wake of the First World War. And we go back even further to the Levelers and the New Model Army, where really, really interesting stuff happened at Putney, not too far from here. But the 1945 veterans vote is fascinating. So we have to remember, and it's interesting now because so much of the tone of like the right-wing out argument with the EU is sepia toned, and they try and kind of capture something of World War II. But we have to remember, veterans kicked out Churchill, rid of him, himself a veteran, for Attlee, also a veteran. Because, and there are a bunch of factors that, but because the socialist offer was better. And that, I think that is part of the experience of Imperial War, tears you apart and kind of remakes you. But with that, with being in the military, particularly in a war of that scale, or just being in the military generally to a lesser extent, is that you are weirdly collectivized. I think it's funny when you look at that, because now when people, right-wing commentators talk about the army, it's almost like they're trying to say it's the same as the army of the Second World War, which of course is very, very different. Now we have a small professional army, then we had mass conscription. And I think a lot of those guys, we have to remember, their fathers had fought in the trenches and come back to nothing, back to absolutely nothing. Harry Leslie Smith talks about this, or did, God rest him. The idea that they came back and they're like, no, this is not happening to us. And there were, of course, reactionaries, and there were veterans involved in the riot. But generally, it seemed to collectivize people and bring into relief for them that the world could be different. And a lot of the settlement of 1945 seems to stem from that. There are other factors, of course, but certainly when I look at the veterans thing, I see how critical veterans can be to a fairer settlement. But of course, as we know, this is contested. It can go one way or the other.
Because, I mean, after World War I, you had a similar phenomenon in the United States, and you had, in the Great Depression, you had, I don't know if you're familiar with the bonus army, but basically, basically, you had a soldiers' march, a veterans' march on Washington to claim the benefits they were promised at the end of World War I, and they hit them with tear gas and drove personnel carriers into their camps. I mean, I think one person died, but obviously, like, there was a significant amount of people injured. But obviously, like, the symbolism could not be. So in a way, the strange thing is in the United States versus Britain is that you've seen bubbling up where it's kind of like it's translated into political action. But here it seems as though more so it's led to concrete things, both on the positive side when you look at Attlee being elected, and like most of the socialist infrastructure of this country, it seems, got its start in that period. Versus, or like things like the Grunwick strike in the 70s, where British Army veterans were helping to break a strike.
Absolutely.
Or I remember reading that there was discussion of potentially like basically like a soldier's plot kind of thing, where people were talking about will they declare martial law in this country in the 70s during like the winter of discontent, like the really bad.
And it's an entire, there's this whole lost history back. Like when you look at there was a really good piece that came out. I can't remember where it was, written by some London-based English leftists about the history of trade unionism, veterans trade unionism, immediately after the First World War, and how these different unions of slightly different stripes were formed. Some of them were much more radically left. Some of them were an attempt to counter that. The Officers Association, which was still exists, and there are other ones which were more liberal or conservative, and in attempts, and I think the phrase that they used were to bring the men back where they should be, under the command of the officers. But there's some really, really interesting history there. And also there's some historical archives I remember coming across where there had been a plan. The fear in the top of the British Army and the establishment was of a Bolshevik Liverpool, which was what they got anyway. And they had plans to use the army to crush veterans they started to stir up around to connect with industrial workers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So there's this whole brilliant history. But I mean, the one for your listeners you really should consider is to go back to, I think the start of all this is the Putney debates and the New Model Army and some of the ideas coming out of that. Is really, really interesting stuff when you want to look at the history of British military radicalism, which is rich and interesting, but obscured because it's dangerous, because the dissenting soldier, an organized dissenting soldier, is a terrifying prospect for the ruling class.
Well, yeah, exactly, because strikes are frustrating to them to begin with, but imagine a strike of the people who ultimately are like the final application of force for your system.
Exactly, yeah, and the army, the people they rely on to go and break strikes.
Yeah,
I mean, this is the thing.
So bring it back then. One of the things that gets me is the only thing I've seen that can really be used as kind of like why the military why they want to kind of posit Jeremy Corbyn as the enemy of the British military seems to come back to Corbyn's opposition to the military occupation in Northern Ireland and his, as I understand it, willingness to dialogue with people like Jerry Adams, like people from Sinn Féin, for our American listeners who aren't super familiar with this, from the Irish nationalist groups that were in Northern Ireland. What do you see as like how, first of all, what do you see as like that opposition? How have you seen that portrayed, like the way that he's made out in the tabloids to be the enemy of the military?
He gives succor to our enemies. He is a traitor. He's an IRA sympathizer, Hezbollah,
Hamas, yeah, exactly, of course.
Hezbollah, and various other groups, Taliban, every possible group of that nature. They will and probably have attempted to connect him with. But what it is at the core of it is partially that he's willing to dialogue, I think, which he has a long history of having dialogue with groups, which is kind of what he's about, because he's a nice old geography teacher when you look at him. But it's also that very idea, while it seems probably not that radical, is a profound threat. Imagine such a man in charge of British foreign policy, as much as he could be, because of course, even if he does come to power, he's still going to have a party full of bloody Blairites.
Yeah.
But even the idea that front bench could be in power is a massive threat to British foreign policy, which central to which is a commitment to aggressive wars overseas and exploitative, extractive trade and business around the world.
And so, to me, when I see that, I wonder, like, does that have traction? Because I'm not from here, and when I do see people reacting to it, it's always like, it's either eye rolling from people that I know in real life, or you might see like the errant person on Facebook, like the angry Sun reader who's like, Jeremy Corbyn, IRA sympathizer, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But I don't know if it actually has any traction, because it seems to me like you'd have to be really deep down the rabbit hole of deluding yourself to look at the military occupation in Northern Ireland as having been successful.
Well, to be honest, I think that's also true, but I think people who... Yeah, sure. I think a lot of people do believe it. I think a lot of people have bought it because they don't tend to analyze it deeply, and because that propaganda about Jeremy Corbyn has been so intense and dense and relentless. I think there are many people in this country who do believe it incorrectly, that he does sympathise with those kind of groups and he is anti-British and so on and so on. Because of course, I mean, we are Britain in that sense culturally, particularly in relation to the armed forces, is a weird rabbit hole. There's a weird thing where the armed forces get a buy. Mm-hmm. They're given a free rein, or they're beyond criticism to some extent. Yeah. They say the BBC has two sacred cows, the royals and the military. It probably has a number of others as well. But certainly it probably has had an impact. But then at the same time, it's this thing where it's contested, isn't it? At the same time, I think even people I know, when I'm from working class community and I still go back to a working class community when I go home. I think people also are very cynical about the press coverage.
Yeah.
So I guess it's another thing which is contested, and we'll see how it plays out. But I think there are people who genuinely believe he has some sympathy for those groups.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because watching the 2017 general election from afar, there were two terrorist attacks that happened during the election period. There was the Manchester Arena bombing, and then there was the London Bridge attack. Mm-hmm. I think it was it London Bridge? Yeah, it was.
London Bridge. Yeah,
I
remember.
And people thought, okay, well, obviously the tabloids lost their minds and the establishment media lost their minds when Corbyn basically made a speech tying this to the larger problem of foreign policy that has sought to basically bomb first and ask questions later. Exactly. And it was shocking to me because it actually was very well received. And to me, that's like the kind of common sense thing I've been wanting. I remember very just angrily watching President Obama's speech in 2009 or early 2010 about like, what are we going to do about Afghanistan? Because I had just come through the complete farce of the presidential election in that country, and they're like, oh, we're going to stay until 2014, and I was just like, why the fuck are you going to stay in this country for 4 more years? We need to leave.
When he announced the surge, was that when he got the Nobel Peace Prize?
Well, the surge was before, because I was actually there. I was there sort of when the surge formally began, but like the units that replaced us were part of like this much larger cohort, and so like they were building all these new bases and everything, and it was like, having just gone at that point, I think I'd been in Afghanistan like 7 months or 8 months, just thinking about like, there's absolutely no way that we're going to win this war. This is not going to happen. Definitely. I mean, we're not winning now. So to me, that kind of common sense, what I perceive as common sense politics, saying like, there's just not a way for us to win this. We shouldn't be doing it.
No. Yeah.
It was striking to me to see that tested, to see someone finally do that, and it actually worked. As opposed to, all of the professional smart people who are going to tell you like, oh no, that projects weakness, etc. And so I'm just wondering, I guess when I see these things, when I see like the British Army, Paris fucking shooting a portrait of Corbyn, I'm like, well, clearly some propagandizing has worked. But then also I see other things, I'm like, well, maybe it's not as cut and dry. Maybe other people are susceptible to a non-interventionist argument.
Yeah, the narrative around Corbyn and his loyalty is it's going to go back and forth. But fundamentally, I think we need to try and focus people's minds on why it's happening. Why it's happening is because he is a threat to the establishment domestically. Of course, we see that in the reaction to their mocking of his programs of social uplift, but also to British foreign policy in its current toxic, violent form, personified in the kind of global Britain. This thing about global, but the idea we're going to go out, gunship diplomacy, pith helmets, whatever other weird shit Gavin Williamson dreams up. Definitely. Yeah, but I was actually at that speech. A bunch of veterans were invited down on the Manchester bombing, and I covered it at the time as a journalist. And he's absolutely right. There is a clear linkage back from to the guy was Libyan, the Libyan Islamic fighting group, some of whom were put in Manchester, and then they were kind of booted out to go back and overthrow Gaddafi, who of course are Al Qaeda in Libya, effectively. And this whole crossover, this whole kind of chain of events back, which brought that kid back who blew up the Ariana Grande concert. I mean, it's clear, it's obvious, and it's in the public domain. So he's absolutely right to say it, and that again is the fact he's on the ball. Because like, I look at some of the people who criticise Jeremy Corbyn, like I see Mike Gapes, Mr. Milk, who's a terrible Blairite Labour MP for any of you your listeners in America.
You famously just met with Nancy Pelosi to discuss why they left, why Mike Gapes and Ian Austin left the Labor Party, because they're incensed about anti-Semitism, as they phrased it. And obviously Nancy Pelosi doing that, it seemed like it's just twisting the knife with Ilhan Omar. Exactly, much larger discussion, of course, for later.
And that seemed to be about as much about American domestic politics as and targeting this young woman, Ilhan Omar, who I think is brilliant. But and he and others, a lot of the thing about the Blairites in or out of the Labour Party, some of them have joined Tinge UK, as we call it now, is that they are convinced they're really good at foreign policy and defence stuff, and they are in fact awful. Whereas Jeremy Corbyn, I can vouch, it has a deep, profound knowledge of international relations. I remember he came to an Occupy before he was famous. Jeremy Corbyn, when he was still just a backbench MP, was always, whenever I met him, he was coming to a meeting, having been to a meeting, and was going to one afterwards, so he had to run off. I remember asking him some inane question, because it was a quiet room about China in Africa. I was studying international relations, China's influence in Africa, and I asked him about the Arab Spring. And he went into this like 20-minute long discussion about the some contested dam in the Ethiopian highlands. Like his knowledge of foreign policy is profound. He should be a professor. But then you get the Mike Gapes and Ian Austins of the world, kind of blithering on about him being not only a threat to the UK's defence, but an enemy of the troops and all this crap.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me too, because this also comes at a very strange moment when, number one, the British military is recruiting using some what we'll describe as very strange methods, like that recent advertising campaign they did about like snowflakes wanted or whatever.
Yeah, and they used Kitchener's your army needs you, snowflake millennial.
Yeah, so if that's sort of like harkening back to World War I iconography, isn't it?
Iconic poster of Kitchener. And it was a very strange thing. Well, I covered that. I worked for an armed forces watchdog called Forces Watch, and we looked at that stuff quite closely. And it was because the first kind of phase, like the opening salvo of that recruiting campaign, we have to understand there is a recruiting crisis in the country. No one's interested, even though there is an economic downturn. No one is interested in joining the military. Was this very it was a weird mashup. I think it was like harkening back to the First World War, the sepia toned thing again. But then it was also aimed at different kinds of people. So it's like join the army gay person, join the army person of color, join the army millennial geek, whatever, gamer. They were really aiming at some interesting cohorts. But then the second wave of that became much more traditional. But what it did was cause a huge impact. They were aiming for controversy. They have ridiculous budgets to spend on marketing and so on. So it was a new line. Previously, it had been more about kind of community. It was this is belonging, which was they always launch in January, and we follow these campaigns quite closely.
It was interesting to me too, because watching that, like in the United States, there's a similar phenomenon taking place that they're having a hard time meeting recruiting quotas. They've decided to try to grow the military again after downsizing it, but also especially in states that they've raised their minimum wage to like $15 an hour, you can make more money working full-time hours, so 40 hours a week at a minimum wage job than you can as a private in the military.
Right, okay.
And so they're having a hard time recruiting. And so one of the things they're doing for some reason is they've decided to reintroduce the World War II era dress uniform.
I think I saw this.
The pinks and greens. And it's just a very strange thing for them to be spending money on. They just when I joined the Army, when I was a cadet, they had the old dress green uniform that had been around since Vietnam, since the Korean War, I think. And then they decided to, I want to say in the first years I was in, they decided to make it mandatory. There was a new uniform that was like the dress blues, which was like a more formal dress. That was going to become the standard uniform. Right, okay. And so now, that was less than 10 years ago, they've decided they're going to do it again. It's strange to me that they'll make these kind of like aesthetic decisions to sort of like hearken to a past era.
I really feel there's this, someone put it to me and it seems so right, that there's this idea of, there's a fading empire. We have a dying empire of which Britain is a part, and the US is the hegemon, and they're trying to draw back on some kind of. It's a very conservative thing, isn't it? Because of course, conservatives are utopians, but their utopia is in the past.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It really feels like this fading power, which is militarily still at the fore, but it's fading in every other sense, trying to like reproduce itself, almost like capitalism. I don't want to get really theoretical, but it is that thing where it's trying to reproduce, an empire trying to reproduce itself by hearkening back to. And it also there's that weird like marketing thing, like that's all dressed like it's fucking Band of Brothers, and like and cash in on some of this this dead kudos.
Nothing excites me more than to harken back to the era when the military was completely segregated, which apparently was a golden age.
That's it. Yeah.
It's weird to me seeing that, because I think that we're having the same problem in the U.S. The U.S. the economy isn't like here, as far as I understand it, it's basically stagnant. Like the UK economy has been like sclerotic, but in the U.S. the economy is still growing, even if at a slower rate. And as a result, they are having a really hard time getting people to join. It seems to me also, as a sort of a transition into this, that another issue that the U.S. has in common with the British military is only recently have they even begun to scratch the surface of dealing with sexual assault and abuse that happens to people in the military.
Yeah, the same here.
And I noticed you commenting on this recently, that like it's not just brushed under the rug. People are literally making light of it.
Yeah.
Like it seems as though it's not a priority for the military to talk about.
They're trying to. There's been a number of some good reportage over the last few years about sexual assault. Obviously, recently there's another case which is yet to come to trial of a young. Here we recruit at 15 and a half. So there was a teenage soldier, an RMP, allegedly assaulted by a group of people, including relatively high-ranking NCOs.
Yeah.
But that's a case in progress. But yeah, there's it's a huge issue here. There was a report a few years ago where a garrison commander instructed his sergeant major, said, go and do a survey of all the women under my command. I don't know how big the garrison was. It would have been one of the bigger ones like Catterick or Colchester. And every single woman of every rank had suffered at least some degree of sexual harassment through to serious sexual assault. And like everyone,
Wow.
like across the board, absolutely across the board. And you can. It was a report on Channel 4 by a journalist called Chris Jepson, I believe. So your listeners can go and dig that up. But it's absolutely striking in its content. But then, of course, and part of the recent recruiting campaign was to go, no, we love women now. Women are great.
Yeah.
Come in and join us. Whereas, of course, we know the reality, and I know from people who are still in the army, the reality isn't much different. And certainly, what's being reported in the news is that the women are still routinely diminished, abused, and assaulted in the military.
So that brings me to another point too. Something that's very different here versus the United States is what is the deal with the recruiting process starting at 16?
So they're desperate to hold on to this. They're absolutely desperate to hold on to this. You actually can join at 15 and a bit just before you're 16. So we are.
In the US, you can join at 17 with parents' permission, and that's even kind of insane for us.
It was you can't deploy till you're 18, and that's that they always go, you can't deploy till you're 18. But of course, we know that a lot of the damage is done through the process of training, and they endure a longer process of training.
Yeah.
It's always, wherever they end up, it's always infantry training. So it's like 16-year-olds doing bayonet training, like the crawling through pig shit and guts and screaming and stabbing. So that they're generally also, the young guys are generally end up in the teeth arms, in the combat arms. They're generally from poorer backgrounds, and they suffer across every metric virtually: prison, drug abuse, domestic violence, drinking problems, homelessness, suffer particularly badly.
Yeah.
But the military is desperate to hold on to this, even though it's not efficient, because so many of those who join do not finish basic training. So they do it. They sign off at a younger age. So it's not even an efficient way to do it. But what happens is that the statistical reality of that is obscured because the military rolls out that guy who's like, I joined at 16, it made a man out of me, and they put these ridiculous arguments like, if I hadn't been in the military, I'd be in prison, as if that's a good argument. That speaks to a much broader societal problem. But of course, some people probably do benefit from it. But overall, the young recruits, particularly young recruits, are more likely to leave. And if they do pass through, even the winners of that lottery are much more likely to suffer serious issues, much more likely to be injured on tour, much more likely to be killed. In Afghanistan, they were much more likely to be killed or injured, these guys who had joined particularly young.
Yeah, for us at least. I mean, I can recall, I went to airborne school, and there's this tradition. I was a cadet, so I was like 20 when I went. Like, I wasn't legally able to drink when I was there. Yeah. And there was a kid there. They have a tradition where the youngest member of the class gets to hold on to like this pair of airborne wings, and has it's like an inspectable item. He has to be able to present them at any formation or whatever. And the soldier that they picked was an active duty enlistee who was going. I think he was supposed to go to the 82nd Airborne. And he was 17. He had had his parents sign his, he graduated. I think he left school, got his graduate equivalency degree, and then enlisted. And his parents let him go. And I mean, he looked like a child. Yeah. He was absolutely into it. Like, he seemed like psychologically he really wanted to be there. But I mean, he absolutely had the demeanor of a child. And I just remember being like, I mean, I was only 3 years older than him at the time, but I remember being weirded out by this. Like, this is just, there's something off about being able and being in this environment in which you are going to go to your unit, and by the time that your unit deploys, you'll probably be old enough to go with them, or they will wait till your 18th fucking birthday and they will put you on a plane to Iraq.
Exactly. Yeah, I saw that as well with guys who were they were disappointed that they would have to deploy a couple of weeks after us or a couple of months after us and sit in camp because they wanted to. They wanted to go. But yeah, that was very common. Yeah. And
so seeing that, and then just seeing it done at a younger age here, it makes me think that there are ways in which the sort of like the neoliberal state has sort of like divested itself of the military, in the sense that you don't have conscription, and it doesn't necessarily play a role in people's daily lives. It has an outsized, emotional importance in the way that like it's portrayed in society. And then they find ways to like incorporate it into the economy, whether it's like we've talked about before we started recording, privatizing recruiting in the UK military,
sure.
or recruiting high school students, or finding ways to make people materially dependent on the military so that they join or so that they don't leave.
This is exactly right. And the recruiting process in this country, of course, is about getting people through the door. But there's another group of people they're trying to recruit. They're trying to recruit the population to support the military, and that is as important through what one general I recall in charge of recruiting called the drip, drip, drip. Like gradually, it's a gradual process. Like you're a kid, you go to a country fair, you play with a general purpose machine gun, and all the way through your life, even if you're not in the army, you're supportive of it. It's normal, and I suppose that is one of the definitions of militarism I've come to understand, where military and war and the preparation for war are like normalized. It's normal that we see this, and that's particularly striking here because, of course, we have this past and present, and of course another reason why it's so important is in imperial terms, we've told America 10% of the battle space is ours.
Yeah,
we will do that. We can provide that, and so the imperative to do that is very, very strong to keep doing that, even though we probably can't practically do that.
Yeah, I mean, like size wise, especially considering the extent to which it seems that they're just going to continue widening the battlefield and continue to get involved in more places. Which has been interesting to me because watching this take place, like you realize that, okay, even if the British military or the American military aren't the ones dropping bombs on Yemen, like there are so many people involved in the infrastructure behind that, whether it's arms sales from the UK, whether it's military advisors in Saudi Arabia, but like our footprint, the footprint that includes these total atrocities backs, it involves people all the way back to whatever the home countries are.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's interesting what's come out of Yemen. There are obviously guys on the grounds, calling in food drops or something to some SBS, I guess they're like our equivalent of the Navy SEALs. And a couple of those guys got shot up a couple of weeks ago. But because I guess what's happened is we can't do big deployments anymore. So now it's these other modes: drones, private military, SF, which in this country we're much less inclined to. Government won't comment on anything SF, which is really backwards compared to the US, Canada, Australia, where they do kind of acknowledge it and there's reportage about it. But it's a weird thing here because all that stuff's happening and the government's like, no comment in Parliament. The defence minister will always, but we don't comment on special forces stuff. And then at the same time, they will leak it to some right-wing newspaper like the Express, who will have like a really in-depth story with quotes from anonymous SAS soldiers.
Yeah, of course.
So they're playing both sides of that the whole time.
Something that I'm wondering too is watching this take place with the way that it seems that traditional news media has lessened influence as a result of social media kind of becoming the means by which most people get information. It seems on one hand you're able to you're able to break out of this mold in which the only way you're going to know about something is if like the Sun or the Times or the Observer is reporting on it. But also it seems as though that same option of selecting things based on your interests is leading to a lot more insane right-wing stuff getting prolificated. Definitely. And to me in particular in the US, so much of that is wrapped around this weird kind of like neurosis about the military's being disrespected somehow, like we're stabbing our veterans in the back and all this stuff that to me seems almost like alarm bells for fascism are ringing.
It is, absolutely, because that is again and again with the stab in the back thing. This is what is happening now with Northern Ireland veterans, with the legacy cases from Iraq, Afghanistan and Northern Ireland is stab in the back. This is like Freikorps stuff, 30s Germany. It's not exactly the same, no one's saying that, but the stab in the back stuff, the wronged soldier is powerful, toxic, dangerous stuff, and this is what's being pushed now, and it's connected to look, I'm a Lexiter, but the particular strand of Brexit that is it's all connected with that and the fallout of the wars, and this huge number of angry veterans who've just fought in failed wars and have come out into austerity. And we have to look at what the actual context these people are living in. Yeah.
Well, this is something interesting to me too, is because it does seem like a lot of that is framed around Brexit. That that you'll see angry veteran sort of messaging about like we're the government is spending X on taking care of migrants even though they're not, and that could be spent on our boys instead. It's the same exact thing in the United States.
Far right. This is they parasitize, don't they? And they do the same thing with is it the so-called Islamic rape gangs in Northern Ireland? They jump straight on that. Anything about veterans, they jump straight on it. There's particular stuff which they'll go and weaponize and jump straight on, and the military, particularly like the human face of like veterans and the suffering and the very real issues that they face will be latched onto by Tommy Robinson.
It's like the Lee Rigby thing, for example.
Oh god,
like,
hugely, yeah.
Horrendous story, but
Absolutely,
it's like, and for I don't know if you want to summarize it or I can summarize it for people. I can cut this out, but
so he was I covered it at the time. He was a young soldier, drummer Lee Rigby, drummer still a rank in some units, was just walking back to his camp in Woolwich, which is a London garrison. I can't remember what unit he was in, and was brutally murdered by two guys claiming jihadist motivation, citing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Both those, there was a long and very public trial. The young man died, obviously, but then there was a series of campaigns to commemorate him. So the far right parasitized his killing and the coverage of it, and then the commemoration and the idea of there's a statue in London, I believe, near the site of his death. But all of the campaigning around that was there was attempts by the far right to take over it, despite protests from Lee Rigby's family. They were straight onto that.
Yeah, because it does seem as though that's the motif there, is that the veterans are being betrayed somehow, and that it's always because of effete liberals, exactly, who don't know what it's like.
Corbyn thing as well. This is absolutely like he's this weak Britain-hating communist,
which is weird to me too, because I mean, you think about Corbyn's background. Like, Corbyn doesn't have a university education. Like, he worked on a pig farm in Jamaica. Like he as I understand it, like his parents were trade unionists, but he didn't really have like a
and it's that's right. That's as I understand it.
Far more salt of the earth than a Mike Gapes type.
Oh, definitely.
And yet, certainly more so than like Gavin Williamson.
Oh, definitely.
And yet, for some reason, he gets portrayed as, like you said, like this effete, this effeminate, like treacherous, unable to confront reality, etc. And it's just it's striking to me because it's not the exact same, but there's a rhyme to it in the United States versus in Britain.
Yeah. And
you can see how transparent bullshit it is, and yet it does seem to have currency with a lot of people.
It does, yeah. I think it does. I think it does because they and it's not just the far right. It's also obviously the British establishment, the press, government play to this stuff as well. So it's top down. Fascism is not a working class disease, it's a middle and ruling class one, and so they certainly play into that as well, and it's useful to them, with potentially very dangerous effects, as we saw with Joe Cox, and kind of as we saw like a kind of reflection of with these young paratroopers shooting at a picture of Jeremy Corbyn. There's a reason people don't like him, and that comes from somewhere, and we have to be very frank about that.
So I'm wondering, because I would guess that easily 90 to 95% of our audience is American. If there were some things that you feel like Americans might learn from the British military experience, both like why there is such a concentrated reactionary element, but then also how soldiers in revolt basically have fostered change in this country.
Sure.
Like, what would you point people towards?
To be honest, I think one of the most impressive stories of resistance, which we didn't have because we didn't go to Vietnam, is the GI movement, and it's one of the most recent ones. Before, obviously, the resistance to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. I know a lot of guys who are involved in that, but I think when you go back, you look at there's a rich, fertile history. The veterans vote in 1945. Go and look at that stuff and look at the role of veterans. Not just prominent veterans like Attlee, but the grassroots stuff. It's always in the grassroots, as we know. Then back to ETAP, the mutinies at ETAP, and veterans activism after the First World War, and then all the way back. I think and maybe the most compelling one to Americans is the New Model Army and Putney, and the rebellion of New Model soldiers, Rainsborough and Sexby, and all these names you should become familiar with, against not just they'd fought the king. And we got rid of him for a while. The first 2 years of freedom, they called it in this country. But then Cromwell, their own general, and that the documents they presented at Putney are particularly important because that formed the basis for what would many years later, become the American Constitution. That stuff is directly relevant. The people writing the Constitution or writing developing the ideas which became your Constitution were first put down in paper and presented to an authoritarian power to say, no, this is what we want.
Yeah.
One man, one vote. I know one man, literally. They weren't that ahead of their time. But a lot of the core, the kind of germ of those ideas came out of the English Civil War, or the English Revolution, as it would be correctly called. So there's a long history of this stuff. But to me, I also was a really good example, which we don't have because we didn't have a Vietnam. We didn't have Vietnam or a Vietnam generally. I always look have it because I know some people are involved in the GI movement and how people organised. Of course, it's different because there was conscription.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very interesting model of how you would organise, because a lot of that, I guess, it's reduced to being the anti-war thing, and obviously it was central to ending the war, but also it was part of a broader that period.
Yeah,
there was a lot going on economically in terms of race. And other things as well. So that's, I always come back to David Courtwright's book, in particular,
okay.
Soldiers in Revolt, which is fantastic.
When you talk about the GI movement, are you talking? Was there an element of this in the United Kingdom you're talking about, or are you talking about what happened in the US with regard to?
Particularly, I always look at that as a great example of how veterans.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Can organise, particularly against war, but also more broadly. But here, the good examples here are absolutely read about Putney Church, the debate at Putney Church. If you come here, go to Putney, go to the church, and there's an inscription above it. It's where they had this debate, Cromwell and his rebellious officers, and said, I can't remember the quote. Maybe we could get it up. It's a brilliant quote by Thomas Rainsford about basically encapsulated the idea of liberal democracy, that every person held under a government should have a say in it. Everybody, not just according to wealth, which is how Parliament was organised then, but everybody should have this, and various other fascinating democratic ideas which emerged from that, from the absolute savagery of the English Civil War, which is a brutal war which killed a huge percentage of the population, but really good stuff.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by that stuff, because I realize that what we learn as electives in European history might very briefly touch on a few things that were going on.
It's the same here in schools. It's the same here in schools, and I guess that's another reason why Jeremy Corbyn is a bit of a threat, because he's talking about like rewriting imperial history, or not rewriting it, but redoing the curriculum to be like this is what happened. And that's another thing which I think goes to so he challenges foreign policy, of course, and that's dangerous, and he challenges domestic neoliberal policy, but also the idea that you go to the heart of education and not have a glowing or glossed over view of British Empire is a terrifying prospect.
Because that's something that seems, I mean, this would be like the last question I want to ask, but this is something that I've noticed here. It seems that there has been a tradition of completely writing things out when they're unpleasant. And I feel like an example of that tendency made manifest is the accidental destruction of all the Windrush landing cards. That would have been inconvenient for the government, so they got rid of them all. And it's like, sure enough, now we incidentally are going to start deporting all these people. In the same vein, like, well, we just accidentally threw all of these records of what we did in Kenya into the ocean. No one knew it could have happened. Those kinds of things, like seeing that happen, that like whether it's because of in order to defend, to create the presumption of innocence, or like to create mitigating circumstances for something that's embarrassing domestically or internationally, that does seem to happen.
Absolutely. The best guy on this is Mark Curtis, who's a historian and writer who I deeply respect, who's kind of the British Noam Chomsky, a brilliant guy. And he talks about he deals with a lot of historical archives, but really goes into how there's two things here. There's our idea of ourself, Britain, a force for good in the world, cutting around the place, helping people out, doling out a bit of aid, whatever. Generally, we're all right. We're the mother. We've got the oldest democracy, mother of parliaments. We're all right, against the reality as attested in our meticulously kept records up until they're dumped in the sea or burned in an archive, which is the face of a profoundly violent, authoritarian state, which does not give a shit about anything but its own enrichment of the people at the top of it. And it's about how these two, how one obscures the other. And Mark Curtis is very good at that. The other guy is Ian Cobain, who's a Guardian journalist who's done a lot of brilliant stuff on Libya and the history of rendition and stuff like that. He's got a brilliant book called The History Thieves, which I encourage you to read, which is literally about how our history is ends up in the sea in the Indian Ocean, because
of course,
it's archives of colonial atrocities coming back from Malaya and places like this.
I'm reminded of this because I remember watching when Harry Leslie Smith was still alive. He would respond to some of these questions that he would get, and sometimes it was from Americans or from people who hadn't lived in Britain or didn't have any recollection, but they'd ask him these things like, well, how did it feel to watch the empire collapse? And his response really took me aback. He said, people were living in utter destitution in this country, and it wasn't until we stopped wasting money on imperial wars abroad that we actually were able to start building a society that took care of people. And that to me really like stuck with me. It's like, it's kind of right. People always frame this, there's this agony amongst reactionaries, amongst defenders of empire, that somehow you're going to lose influence. And then it's like, at the same time, yes, but what are you doing? all of these things that you're doing that you know are useless, or you know are ineffective, or that you know are just like rapacious profiteering.
Sure.
What can you do instead?
Exactly.
And that's the thing, like looking at Corbyn's politics and leftism in general, like to me, that makes it exciting is the idea that like you can actually envision something, you can work towards something where you're able to direct the same resources that can build 10 fucking aircraft carriers towards something that's going to help people.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's absolutely true. And it's also the case that we have to be kind of, because of that, the money which was used to found all those things also was, we're talking about a reallocation.
Yeah.
So it's important to know that a lot of that money came from empire.
Yeah.
Britain was able to build that because it had the wealth which it had extracted very violently from other places. So whenever we talk about it, it's true that we should use that. It's also important that we recognize the huge amount of suffering upon which even the welfare state is built, and how it's, in a sense, it's compromised as well because of that background. It's important that part of what I suppose we're talking about when we talk about curriculums and self-images is accepting that we're compromised. In terms of empire, particularly in this country, for a lot longer than in the US. Like a lot of what we have is built on the suffering of others, which is not to moralize and kind of freeze and become useless, but to say, but to be very frank about it in terms of being honest about our own history, from everything from the slave trade to the sacking of India and more recent things like the great heist of our times, Iraq, and so on.
Well, Joe, I was going to say I'm going to give an opportunity to plug the book. If there's any other thing you'd want to plug besides Soldier Box that we can put on here, the stuff people should look for.
My book is it's published by Verso Books. It's called Soldier Box. It's a kind of a memoir which really antagonizes crank veterans, and I revel and glory in it every day on Twitter. So come and follow me at Joe Glenton. I'm sure it's available in the US as well. So go and check. You can
find it on iTunes book or on Apple Books. And
I write regularly for various platforms, so my work is always there, and I'll put it up as it comes out. And also, I work for an organization called Forces Watch now, which is a military watchdog. We look at things like recruitment of young people, the spread of militarism, the encroachment of the military on democracy. We've done some really good stuff on that, and various other things. We're a small NGO, but we try and put up a good fight, because we're most think tank type organizations around defense are compromised deeply, and part of the establishment, RUSI, Chatham House. Well, they do some great work, and they have space for other voices. But Forces Watch is please pay attention to us. We do good work, but that's about it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for making time to be on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Buddy. Great to see you.
Thanks again for listening. And just remember, if you like this interview, you can get ones just like it and a whole lot more by subscribing to our Patreon. You can also get access to our Discord server, where you can speak with other fans of the show. And you can follow me on Twitter at In These Deserts, follow Francis at Army Strang, follow the show at Hell of a Way. And if you have a minute, please rate us on iTunes. It would really help us a lot. Thanks.